Hi, everyone. Thanks to everyone who's joined already. We're just going to give everyone till about 2:01 to start. My name's Jeremy Sporn. I'm the marketing director over here at Pivot Point Security. I'll turn it over to John Very in just a few minutes. But like I said, we'll give a chance for everyone to jump on in. 2:01. We'll try to start promptly. If you just joined, it looks like we have a few more people trying to log on now, so we'll give them an extra 50 seconds and we'll jump right in. Thanks everyone for joining already, and we'll get started in just a sec. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, How to Manage Cyber Risk in the Public Sector. Again, my name is Jeremy, and I'm the Marketing Director here at Pivot Point Security. Before John begins, a few quick logistical items. Questions are absolutely encouraged. This session is meant to be as valuable to you as possible, and that really only works if you get the information you need to be successful. So feel free to send questions while John is presenting. We'll go through all the questions at the end of the presentation. I'll make sure to read them aloud so that everyone can hear them. Excuse me, and then John will address them one at a time. Questions can be typed into the question box, and again, John will answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. There should be plenty of time for Q&A. If you do run into any technical issues during the presentation and think you may miss something important, don't worry. This is all being recorded, and the presentation will be sent digitally to the email address you used to register for the webinar. We'll also send everyone a copy of the presentation deck itself. It has a lot of key data points in it, so you'll be able to have that. Quick note about our presenter. John Very is the managing partner of Pivot Point Security, and he has helped deliver almost 200 reports to municipal governments with key information and insights on their cyber risk exposure, and most importantly, the best next steps to reach their desired security state. Many of us like to call him the Brad Pitt of municipal cybersecurity, but of course he is my boss and makes me say that. So without further delay, John, the floor is yours, and feel free to take it away.
I hope you're not implying I don't look like a young Brad Pitt. I mean, that'd be pretty insulting.
I would never go that direction. No, of course not.
Good afternoon, everybody. Is everyone? So now I'll get it back to Jeremy, because this is the slide where Jeremy wants to pitch you and tell you how wonderful a company that we are. And now I'm not going to do it because he was mean to me. But I do think that the important things here, and for framing the context of this conversation, Pivot Point is a pure play information security firm. Our job is to help organizations become demonstrably secure and compliant. So that's one part of this. The second part is that those 200 reports that Jeremy was talking to, that's just over the last couple of years. Pivot Point has worked extensively over our 17, 18-year career in the government sector, both at the state, county and municipal levels as well as city level. So all of the data that you're going to see herein is gathered from work that we've actually done with a lot of these entities. You know, government is a challenge. You know, we do work on the private sector and public sector, and there are some unique challenges to the government space. You know, one of those is funding. You know, of course, you're funded by taxpayers, and keeping that those costs down to a minimum, and also that inability to flex budget from year to year is definitely one of the challenges that we see with becoming highly secure. We're all faced with the same challenge, right? There is currently a significant global security talent shortage. A number you see is 1 million. I saw a number the other day of 1.8 million security practitioners worldwide. We're short at this point in time. And you know, a smaller municipal government is not an exciting place for a person to go when they can go instead to Google or Microsoft or Amazon or some bigger name brand entity. You know, resources being personnel, resources being that funding as well, resources being access to certain technologies. And the last, of course, is knowledge. You know, we all have this challenge of, you know, training is a challenge. Having the time bandwidth to get knowledge up is definitely a challenge that we see, significant challenge in the municipal government space. So from this work that we've done, some of the kind of key data points to set the framework for the conversation we're having, 4% of the people in the municipal space we work with approximately have a good fundamental cybersecurity awareness education program, right? That's a key problem, making sure, because people are your greatest threat surface. They're also your greatest threat detection mechanism if they're well educated. 74% of the municipal entities that we've worked with outsource critical services, you know, think payroll, credit card processing, third-party administrators, things of that nature. And those services often are processing data, which we would consider to be sensitive, right? Credit card data, health information, personally identifiable information, right? And those are high-risk forms of data. We're outsourcing this data, but yet we don't have good vendor risk management practices. Those are the practices necessary to ensure that the third parties that we're giving the data to do a good job of managing the risk associated with that data. Password policy, you know, passwords are arguably one of the single most important things we have, right? They're often the single line between us and our identities, or us and critical source of data, but yet 85% don't have password policies that really live up to good guidance. And then the last part, the 5% disaster recovery and IT business continuity. The concern there with disaster recovery is with the preponderance of ransomware. If we don't have backups of data, ransomware can be a really significant nightmare. You saw what happened in Atlanta. If you have good disaster recovery policies, you know, places where you're backing up key sources of data, ransomware becomes a nuisance, but we can always recover. So let's talk about cyber liability loss control, right? How can we together reduce the likelihood of a claim? And from if you're part of a member organization, that sounds pretty good. If you're part of a government risk pool, you know, attracting and retaining members, that's obviously going to sound pretty good as well. The key here is understanding risk, and what we're trying to accomplish, right, is to ensure that high risk data, sensitive information, is being protected in a manner that's not only consistent with good practice, which will keep it secure, but also in a way which is in accordance with relevant laws and regulations, right? Because there's risk associated with non-compliance or non-conformance. The way to do that is working with the municipalities, working with the GRP administrator to identify and understand key elements of the coverage that are impacting how we manage risk in these organizations. So as an example, we did work with a county that had a cyber liability insurance policy for a number of years. And on review, we found that there was an exclusion for databases greater than 50,000 names. And the primary purpose for having this was to protect data on their senior program, which had roughly 57,000 names in that particular database. So again, if you don't understand the coverage, then you can't understand the risks in the context that we should be looking for. Understanding key known risks, a good way to know about your key known risks is what are the claims that are occurring at this point in time. We see claims for ransomware. We see claims for phishing attacks that lead to denial of service. We see a lot of claims right now for electronic fund transfers being manipulated through fraudulent purposes. And ultimately, what our goal would be is to use this information to ensure that we're increasing the security controls that are in place in the member organizations to a level that is going to reduce the likelihood of these cyber breaches occurring, which of course would reduce the likelihood of these insurance claims. And the way we do that is through some combination of assessing risk, assessing the control environment. Once we understand what some of the challenges are, putting the tools in place for organizations to use, and ensuring that they've got the education necessary to do that. Here's a pretty picture of that. So we effectively, when I talked about the risk management process in the last slide, we talked about scope, right? Understanding the GRP, the context, and the risks. And we do that, and we call that process a cyber liability insurance risk assessment. Once we understand that cumulative level of risk, right? So we understand the risk for each member, and then we understand the risk cumulatively, we can determine what types of security assessment steps would be beneficial to understand whether or not the members have the proper controls in place to mitigate those risks. Where we find gaps, right, that's where we start with that mitigate step there in the lower left corner, is once we understand the gaps, we can begin to mitigate those gaps by providing tools, templates, and the support to address them. Education is an important part of both mitigating the gaps and also ensuring that on a go-forward basis, that our employees become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And then advise is the idea that risk evolves. Risk evolves because technology evolves. Risk evolves because regulations evolve. Risks evolve because threats evolve. So ensuring that the members understand that evolving risk and they update their scope and understand the risk and update the controls to manage that risk is what this idea of rinse, lather, repeat, and this proven process recirculates on itself. In projects that we've done, this is typically the 4 phases we run through. So we talked about that risk assessment, right? Key to understanding risk. You can do that pretty easily through some web-based surveys to understand those risks. You probably already understand many of these key risks across your individual municipality, or if you're working in a government risk pool, across many of your members. Assessing the controls can be done in a couple different ways. You might do something called a vulnerability assessment. That is the idea of, let's say, looking at an organization from the perspective of a hacker from the internet and determining whether or not there is a likelihood that a malicious user could create an impact through some type of a technical attack or some type of a phishing attack. You could be a part of that vulnerability assessment, might also be a phishing or social engineering assessment. Or you can also do, if you want to get a little bit more in depth and have a greater degree of assurance, you could do what we would refer to as a gap assessment, which is a review of the controls that they have in place against good practice. So if we're looking at that password policy, we're looking at their third-party risk management policy. Are they doing logging? Do they do HR screening of new onboarding of employees, right? Those would be the types of things you would look at in a gap assessment. Once we understand those gaps, next is to ensure that you're communicating that information to people, giving them an actionable plan to address those findings and recommendations. And the way you do that is to provide, tools, templates, sample policies and procedures, and providing them the guidance necessary to be successful in the implementation of these controls. Digging in a little bit, so when I use the term risk assessment, a lot of people their eyes blur a little bit, and it's not tangible. So trying to make this a bit more tangible. Risks are, the way I like to think of risk is thinking of it in terms of information and the context that information lives in. And in most municipalities, the key sources of risk are information, that being, PHI is patient health information, PII is personally identifiable information, PCI refers to credit card data. Those are going to be the predominant forms of risk in your organization. And then the laws that govern their operation, things like HIPAA, things like state laws like New Jersey Identity Theft Prevention Act, other guidance through the state. The services you provide, so different municipalities provide different services. If you're operating a municipal utility authority, we've got a different class of risk. We've got a risk associated with the SCADA systems that are inherent there, perhaps with the chemicals that are there that are used to treat the water in that particular case. So that's what I mean by risk and understanding the context of that risk. Boiling it down to something a little bit more specific, some of the key risks you're going to see in most municipalities. Phishing, so a statistic the other day, 91% of all cyber related incidents are, I believe the root cause was a phishing attack. So a phishing attack which results either in ransomware being disclosed or credential stealing malware being exposed, right, which impact key services that your municipality delivers. That's a risk we see in every organization we work with. Again, I gave the example of the senior center before. That would result in a HIPAA compliance gap, which could result in disclosure requirements. We see right now in many of the municipalities that we've been working with, this fraudulent electronic fund transfer issue, where they don't have good practices in place to ensure that someone who issues a text message or issues a phone call or sends an email that says, please transfer this money from this account to this account is following the right processes, which are yielding a loss of dollars. And then last, many municipalities are moving to a shared services model where we're seeing a collapse of public safety network, K through 12 networks, and the law enforcement networks and the business administration networks. And if that's not done well, what we can see is that an attack in the school environment can result in a compromise of data in the law enforcement environment. So these are the types of things that we look at from a risk assessment. Once we understand those risks, we can look to say, what are the controls that we need to put in place to ensure that those risks are managed well? So do we have good network segregation? Do we have a good password policy that requires reasonably and appropriately strong passwords that are not easily guessable? Do we have good practices around bringing new employees on and ensuring that they're assigned to only the information they should have access to? And vice versa, when someone is being terminated or leaves the organization, are we shutting off their access appropriately? Vendor risk management, key area, right? We talked about 75% of municipalities outsourced a significant percentage of their IT operations and data processing, data touching operations. Do we have the right controls in place to ensure those organizations we're outsourcing it to are managing that risk effectively? We talked about the 4 or 5% have some form of security awareness training, which is sufficient to help your users recognize phishing, ransomware, spear phishing, whaling attacks, and to know how to identify those emails, and also know what they should do in the event that they do see those emails, but yet you have not yet clicked on them. So those are some of the examples of the areas that we cover during the gap assessment. This would be an example of what a gap assessment report might look like. It gives you an idea of what is the control, what are we trying to accomplish, who's responsible for it. In your particular case, where are you at? What did we find, and what are our recommendations? So this is this idea of producing actionable content, providing actionable information to your municipalities. We talked about on the first slide in a summary a lot of these common gaps which we've identified. One we didn't talk about and we see is that many municipalities, certainly most municipalities that are less than 50 plus people, are using outsourced IT. And what they do is they're reliant on their IT vendor for information security, which becomes a little bit of a fox watching the henhouse. So that's one thing that if you are relying on an IT vendor, please be aware that that can be a risk. When we run vulnerability assessments against municipalities, we can actually determine which ones use the same IT service providers based on the vulnerabilities that we see, because they have a process by which they're configuring each municipality in the same way. So each of those same municipalities would have the same vulnerabilities that we would see. The rest of this is what we kind of touched on in that first slide, so I won't go back over it. So once we get to the point where we are giving you that actionable guidance, the next step is, okay, let's take action on this. And the reality is that in any organization, let alone a municipality, there's always lots of things that could be done better. So how do you prioritize what should be done, and what should be done in what order? We like to recommend that you take a risk-based approach, and when we provide the guidance, we give it in a risk-based way. So what we do is we'll say, hey, you've got these 15 or 20 things that you probably want to look at. Here are the top 4 or 5 which represent the highest degree of risk to you. And then let's start at the top and actually knock them off one at a time, right? That's going to give you the greatest return on investment for your time and energy and effort. And it's important to note that the vast majority of the recommendations that we end up making are not what I'll call capital expenditure type items. We're not generally saying, hey, you need to put in place a $100,000 security information event management solution, or you need to put in place an IDS or IPS solution. The vast majority of the risk can be typically mitigated through simple updates to policy and procedure and education. And those don't require a notable financial investment. They require time, but not necessarily significant financial investment. And then if you are a GRP, the nice thing is that rather than having each of your members make the same investment in time, energy, and effort to produce vendor risk management materials, or a password policy which is reasonable and appropriate to a municipality that has both business administration offices and public safety or law enforcement networks. Rather than have each one of the 30 or so members within your organization spend the time to do that, what we're seeing, you can get economies of scale by working at the GRP level, by producing call it a template, call it an example, a sample that can be easily leveraged and quickly modified to meet the requirements of each individual municipality's individual context. So some of those tools that we think are valuable, in terms of when we hit the phase of understanding what the gaps are and how do we close those, right? So we talked about this idea of policy templates. We talked about security awareness education. There are a lot of good products that are available on the market at a very reasonable price point that can be used to educate end users to minimize that phishing risk. A good security awareness education program will probably drive down a phishing success rate from, depending upon who you believe. Typically, we see success rates of between 25 and 40% in an uneducated environment. So that means that if we send out 100 phishing emails, somewhere between 25 and 40 of the users will actually click on a link in that email or open up a document that they should not have opened, which in theory could have been used to plant malicious malware on their system, which would yield some level of unintended access. We see that organizations that have very strong security awareness education programs can reduce that risk down to 4 or 5%. So it's not perfect, but that's a significant improvement. And then if you combine that with some other good practices that are often part of the policy templates we'll provide. So as an example, if you can combine that with a reasonably good incident response plan so people know what to do, a decent DR plan, so even if a piece of ransomware hits your network, it doesn't have that much impact. If you can combine that with a reasonably good vulnerability management program, which reduces the likelihood that even if they click on that link, that the system would be vulnerable to that type of attack. So in other words, if it's an attack that exploits an older version of Adobe, if you've got a good patch management process that is updating that, doesn't matter if they clicked on the link. And then the last thing would be a good, and we'll provide a policy template around this very often, a good what we refer as configuration management. So as an example, if you can not have each of your end users running their desktops at what we call an administrative level, or you can ensure that you've got IDS or you've got a personal firewall, or you've got good antivirus installed through good configuration management practices, all those in combination with that security awareness education will take that risk of you being hit by a bad attack caused by phishing from that 40% level that we talked with, down to 1% or less. One of the things which is helpful, and one things that we've seen some forward-thinking government risk pools do, is provide sort of a help desk. You see this very often for like EPLI practices or something of that nature, where there's an HR guy that they can call if they've got an issue. We see that same issue being applied to the security help desk. So, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, or I'm looking at outsourcing this particular function. How do I know if they're secure? What questions should I be asking? Giving them that availability to ask an expert on demand. That's an interesting area that we've seen an evolution towards. We talked about vulnerability assessments. Another interesting thing to consider would be vulnerability alerting. That is where once a month you're scanning, and rather than running a full assessment, which has a level of overhead that has a cost associated with it, you can do alerting, which just means that in the event that there is a vulnerability that might cause an impact to the municipality, they get an email letting them know that. We talked about that social engineering and phishing. So that the idea there is not only educate your people, but test your people. Testing is part of that educational process. So most of the good vendors of security awareness education programs have a phishing component, which dovetails with it. And last, we talked about that issue of vendor risk management. You can outsource IT operations, or you can outsource credit card processing, or you can outsource payroll, but you don't outsource the risk associated with that process. So ensuring that you know that the people that are responsible for that are managing the risk in accordance with your risk appetite, that's an important component. So assuming you did everything that we talked about, what do we hope is going to happen, and what should happen? You're going to improve the overall security posture of each member and the pool as a whole. Even just, so much of security is making people conscious and getting people thinking and making people aware of information related risk and what they need to be doing. So just the principle of beginning to put this in place starts to improve things. And then going through the program in the way that we suggested is going to put people in a position where they understand all of the critical risks that are in their environment, and where they have control gaps that align with those risks that make it more likely that those risks would become realized. And what it will do is give them the tools and give them the awareness and give them the support that they need to begin to systematically close those gaps. By doing that, what we should have is we should reduce not only the number, but or the significance or impact of cyber liability claims. Ideally, that's going to help control what are now currently escalating cyber liability insurance premiums. That's very important in the municipal space because many municipalities have a capped amount that certain areas of the budget can rise. I think in New Jersey it's like 2%. So if your cyber liability insurance goes up 30%, you have a problem. Right? So this idea of controlling the CLI premiums is really important. If you are a GRP, this risk management function is greatly appreciated. This is an area of important concern for many business administrators, many elected officials. So knowing that their GRP is providing this valuable service certainly improves satisfaction, which hopefully has the effect of either maintaining or increasing membership. So I kept that short. I kept that sweet. Everyone's got a lot of work to do. Hopefully it was useful. How do we do on questions, Jeremy?
All right, I have two lined up right now, so I'll feed you the first one. And if anyone wants to type in one while we're talking, please feel free and to go ahead and do so. And you actually touched upon this towards the end, but in someone saying that insurance premiums are still currently reasonably low for cyber liability. Do you see this staying put, or do you see this moving in the near future?
Good question. So, I think like anything, prices always go up. The folks that I've spoken with, at the different carriers and at the different brokers, is that they believe cyber is going to follow the same arc as a lot of new and evolving insurances do. That the providers don't know how to price it. They realize that it's an opportunity. They tend to underprice it to grab market share, gain clients, and then increment pricing. Working with the 200 or so active clients outside of the municipal space, and then the 200 in the municipal space, we see a number of our clients that carry the cyber liability have been telling me that they've seen their premiums go up anywhere from a few percent up to 24% in the last couple years as they've gone through renewals. I would expect it to go up. I do think that I do think it's an interesting question, and one that I expect we're going to see come to fruition. That most people believe that I've spoken with that currently it's underpriced.
Gotcha. All right. The second one that's on the block is so is this a one-time security assessment, or is this an ongoing process?
So if you go back to the one graphic that we had, where we went through the 6 steps, and you saw the arrow that looped back up. Unfortunately, security is not a destination. It's not a point in time. Security is an ongoing endeavor. Risk management is an ongoing endeavor, just the same, in information security, just the same way as it is in every other area of insurance. No, what I would say is that, like most risk management activities, the level of effort at the onset is high, but then the level of effort required to maintain the security posture is significantly lower. So we do a lot of work on the front side, understanding risk. That gap assessment is a fair degree of work. We begin to implement those, get those policies and standards and procedures in place to manage that risk effectively. Once we hit that point, then it's only change that requires updates. So that means that the amount of ongoing effort necessary will not be all that significant.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. We'll give everyone one more sec to type in a question. Just anyone else listening, John will actually be, if anyone's attending the Prima conference next week, John will actually be there, so you can see for real if he actually is the Brad Pitt of municipal cybersecurity for yourselves. It looks like those are all the questions that we have. So like I said, if you did join in, you'll be getting a copy of the presentation as well as a recording of the webinar. We do really appreciate everyone joining. John, I don't know if you want to give a little sign off, but we do appreciate your time.
Same here. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, everyone.